David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So it's very quickly getting very real in the impeachment inquiry against Donald Trump. This is starting to now get into people are going to have to show up. People are going to have to provide documents or maybe face the consequences of not doing so, although it's not totally clear in this administration if there will be ever consequences for ignoring subpoenas. And the latest person subpoenaed is Donald Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, who has been subpoenaed by the House Intelligence Committee to provide a number of different documents. And Rudy, of course, is one of the sort of top people who's been involved in this campaign to pressure Ukraine into helping Donald Trump in 2020 by investigating, which is, of course, code for investigate and determine that you, as a result of that investigation, need to say negative things about Joe Biden. The letter to Rudy Giuliani identifies him as an agent of Trump in the scheme to advance Trump's interests through abuses of power. And they want documents from Rudy. And I don't know that they're going to get documents from Rudy. This is an administration that has gotten away with simply ignoring subpoenas. And subpoena power, although not uncontroversial, I mean, listen, there are reasonable debates you can have about edge cases or blurry area cases with regard to subpoena power. Can subpoena power be abused? You know, with any mechanism, there are debates to be had. But this is an administration that has just directly and unabashedly flouted subpoena power, ignoring all sorts of requests for everything from Donald Trump business records that could be tied to emoluments clause violations or potential money laundering, all the way up through and including subpoena requests for witnesses to show up and talk about possible crimes that they have witnessed. So I hope that subpoenas that are a part of an impeachment inquiry will not be allowed to be ignored. But I don't know the answer to that because the precedent under this administration has been that they just ignore them and then there are no consequences. Now, we've also learned in the last 24 hours that the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was also listening in live on that phone call on July 25th between Donald Trump and the Ukrainian president. We didn't previously know that prior to, 12 or 16 hours ago. And Pompeo himself is becoming a bigger and bigger part of this entire impeachment inquiry. And what we are seeing, if we zoom out a little bit, is that this is growing into one of the most sort of all-encompassing political scandals for an administration in a long time. And I think that it actually is informative to compare and contrast to the impeachment of Bill Clinton, because a lot of people on the right love to bring up Bill Clinton in the context of Trump's wrongdoing and impeachment and say, look, Clinton got impeached. Let's go back to Bill Clinton's impeachment. Bill Clinton was impeached for lying about an affair. Bill Clinton cooperated. Bill Clinton did not attempt to tamper with witnesses. He didn't attempt to obstruct the process of investigation. He didn't ignore subpoenas. His attorney wasn't part of the scandal. His Secretary of State wasn't part of the scandal. His Attorney General wasn't part of the scandal. And this is one of the major differences here that we see with what's happening with Donald Trump. It's not just Trump did a thing. First of all, the thing Trump did is really bad. It's way worse than lying about an affair. It's pressuring is not even a heavy enough word, but it's extorting a foreign power to smear a possible election opponent. That's number one. But Trump's lawyer, former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, is involved. His Attorney General William Barr is involved. His Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is involved. Documents related to the incident, in this case, a full transcript of the phone call on July 25th with the Ukrainian president, has been moved from the place where it would normally be kept to some other place in order to obscure and obfuscate. So anyone even remotely comparing this to the Clinton impeachment, I welcome that comparison. If you think that there's anything similar about the two situations, you don't understand the facts or you're deliberately ignoring them. But that then gets us to the real sort of important pressing question, which is what does happen if Rudy Giuliani ignores the subpoena? Can you imagine that? I mean, just think back to the immediately post 9/11 days. At one point, Rudy Giuliani was a widely respected politician in the United States, even by many Democrats. Now, I want to be very clear. Many of those Democrats disagreed with the policies of Rudy Giuliani in New York City, for example, broken windows policing and so on. But in a very general sense, to the extent that you see bipartisan, not support, but at least recognition that someone is a good faith actor, Rudy Giuliani was one of those people for a period of time in the United States. Then he became Mayor 9/11, where any question he was asked politically was, you remember I was mayor during 9/11, right? And now he has become Trump's hatchet man, involved in who knows how many possible crimes, involved as maybe the most irrational, reflexive defender of anything that Donald Trump does or says, always, all the time. And there's some sad element to it. I read some commentaries online saying it's actually sad what's happened to Rudy Giuliani. He chose this. He chose this. So I don't feel bad for the guy, but it is interesting to look at just how far he has fallen from being an American political character that at one point at least had the respect, if not support, of people on the other side of the political aisle. We will see what happens as far as the Rudy Giuliani subpoena. Let's talk about the whistleblower now. Donald Trump is actively putting in danger the life of the Ukraine whistleblower, according to the whistleblower's attorneys. Now, I told you the day that the Trump-Ukraine whistleblower scandal broke that I hope that the whistleblower's identity is protected. Because if Trumpists find out who the person is, whose whistleblower report triggered an impeachment inquiry of their beloved Lord and Savior, Donald Trump, that whistleblower's life is instantly in danger. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. I'm talking about a real and present danger to that whistleblower's life. And as if we needed any more evidence about how Donald Trump feels about the whistleblower and the whistleblower's sources, remember that last week, Donald Trump was caught on a recording talking about, what about when we used to kill whistleblowers or sources or whatever? Remember this recording?
But basically, that person never saw the report, never saw the call, meaning never saw the call, heard something and decided that he or she, whoever the hell it is, sort of like almost a spy. I want to know who's the person that gave the whistleblower, who's the person that gave the whistleblower the information? Because that's close to a spy. You know what we used to do in the old days when we were smart, right? The spies and treason. We used to handle it a little differently than we do now.
Well, it's getting much, much worse. Even in advance of the individual being outed, which I hope doesn't happen, the whistleblower's lawyers have put out a letter saying that Donald Trump is endangering their client's life by calling them a traitor, by issuing threats of retaliation, by alluding to what about execution of the whistleblower or their sources. The audio I played for you just now is referenced in this letter, and this is, of course, completely counter to how whistleblowers are supposed to be treated in the United States. There is something called the Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989. But forget about that. Even beyond that, there is the tradition of how this country is supposed to respect whistleblowers. That, of course, has been thrown completely out the window by this administration, much the way that respect and support of a free and independent press has been thrown out the window completely by this administration. And as the whistleblower's lawyers point out, most countries where the leader of the country treats a whistleblower the way Donald Trump is treating this whistleblower, most of those countries are not democracies. And it is very ugly what is going on. Consider how backwards this is. Donald Trump said something incredibly disturbing on a phone call with the Ukrainian president. You could argue what Donald Trump was doing was un-American, or at least did not put the interest of the American people as the number one priority. People heard the phone call and they reported it to the whistleblower. And Trump says that is called spying. This is someone, both the whistleblower and the sources for the whistleblower, these are people whose interests are conserving the national security of the United States. Their motivation is the maintaining of the sovereignty of the United States over our own elections without foreign influence. The motivations of the whistleblower and the sources are pro-American. They are about maintaining the systems and processes that have been established in the United States as the ones that we want. Trump is trying to circumvent that, but yet he's calling the people trying to maintain these systems spies, traitors, enemies, all of this stuff. Now, I do have to go a step further here. I get why the whistleblower's identity needs to be kept secret. I hope that it is, because that person's life will be at risk if their identity is revealed. They are at risk of death if their identity goes public. But we have to recognize that on the basis of the way that Donald Trump has bamboozled and primed his followers, it actually does help the Trump side for the whistleblower's identity to be unknown because of how they think. They will build a character around the person. Crooked Hillary, Pocahontas, whatever. They will smear the whistleblower, and the whistleblower not only won't be present to defend themselves, they won't even be a known entity. It will be Trump's case against this unknown, hidden person, and it will become part of the case for the defense of Trump's view. Listen, this person won't even show their face. I go with Trump's view on this. It's disgusting that this is the situation, but sadly it is. And you know that they will use the whistleblowers, as at least up until this point, anonymity against them. Let me know your thoughts about this. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. Make sure you're following me on Twitch as well at twitch.tv/David Pakman. We had a great live stream last night on Twitch. I hope you'll catch the next one.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Barry Johannes and Catherine Foster. Barry and Catherine, thank you for your support. I do appreciate it. I also want to say thanks to Jason Rose, who is not today's new member of the day, but rather today's longtime sustainer of the day. Jason's been a member for almost 5 years. And I encourage you not only to join, but stick around for a few years like Jason has done. You can sign up at www.joinpakman.com. $6 a month, $60 for the year. I think it is extraordinarily reasonable, but you can save 40% if you would like using the coupon code THISIS2020. I have sad news for you, and it really is sad. I'm not being satirical in any way. The next Democratic debate is going to be the worst one yet. And this is as bad as previous Democratic debates have been this election cycle. The next one, which is number 4 in the middle of this month, will be the worst one because the requirements to get into the debate aren't strict enough at this late stage in the game, just a couple of months from when voting will actually start in the Democratic primary. We have 12 people that have qualified for the 4th debate, and the entire debate is going to take place on one night. We are going to have 12 candidates on the stage at the same time. And I've told you before, 10 candidates on the stage times 2 nights for 20 total candidates. There are many problems there. You don't see all the candidates on the stage together, so you can't really evaluate them on the basis of how they all talk to each other. You had nights where Warren and Bernie were split up. You had nights where Biden was separated from other frontrunners. So that was a problem. And then at the same time, with 10 people on the stage each night, the level of depth was very low because you had 10 people competing for speaking time. So when the number of people who qualified for the 4th debate, which is on October 15th, hit 10 and then hit 11 and then hit 12, the immediate question was, are they going to do 2 debates with 6 people on each stage, which might actually allow for a little bit more depth, even if we are splitting up the candidates onto 2 stages? And the answer is no. CNN, which is co-hosting this debate with the New York Times, has decided they are going to do one night, 12 candidates all on the same stage. And between CNN, again, co-hosting the debate, which was just terrible last time, right-wing framing of questions. They shut down my live stream of the debate, as you might remember, and more candidates than ever on the stage at once. This is just going to be terrible. That's the reality. The debate is going to be on Tuesday, October 15th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We will attempt live coverage, of course. And the reality is that no one can look good with 12 people on the stage, especially when you're answering poorly framed questions from the moderators. So who's responsible here? Is it CNN and the New York Times for wanting it to be on one night? Is it the Democratic National Committee for accepting that it all be done on one night? Who has the power here? It's not completely clear, but what I can tell you for sure, what is very clear is that they are making the debates not only unwatchable, but completely useless in terms of actually providing us with the information that we need to accurately and in an informed way determine who it is we want to support in the 2020 Democratic primary. Now, let's do a little math. If with 12 candidates on stage, if the debate ran 3 hours with no commercials, that's 180 minutes, 12 candidates, that's 15 minutes per candidate. So that's already not great. Like if I'm going to decide who I'm supporting, I want to hear from them for more than just 15 minutes. But again, that's with no breaks, with no anything else. Remember that the last CNN debate started with some overly produced sports game-like introduction, opening statements from candidates, which I find completely useless, and a commercial break before the first question. It was 25 minutes into the scheduled start of the debate before the first question was asked. They also were scheduled for 3 hours, or maybe for 2, but in any case, they ended up 20 minutes shy of 3 hours. So you take away 25 minutes from the front, you take away 20 minutes from the end, and on that basis, each candidate gets a little over 11 minutes to speak. And then if we add in the fact that they are taking a couple commercial breaks throughout the entire thing, what you end up with 12 candidates on the stage, effectively in a, quote, 3-hour debate, is 10 minutes of speaking time per candidate. This is not how I want to pick a presidential candidate. It's embarrassingly bad. And then, of course, there's also the issue of the fact that with absolutely no chance of winning, you have candidates participating and taking away from important conversations that we could be having. I'll give you an example. Imagine if Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden could spend 45 minutes, just the three of them, talking about exactly how their healthcare plans would work. We would be able to actually press Joe Biden on how not progressive his healthcare plan is. Bernie Sanders would be able to actually hash out with Elizabeth Warren, okay, well, Elizabeth, if you're open to Medicare for all, but you're also open to other options, give me one of those other options. Let's debate in detail how one of the other options would work. But it's not going to happen. We're going to hear from, irrelevant nonsense from Tom Steyer and Tulsi Gabbard and Amy Klobuchar and other people who have no shot at this. It's going to be terrible. I will be watching, of course, but it is not going to be a debate that will leave us drastically more informed, in depth about the positions of the candidates that actually have a shot at this thing. Mistakes all around. And unfortunately, the debates seem to be getting worse as we go, not better. 2% of Black Americans approve of the job that Donald Trump is doing. There are lots of narratives that are completely false and yet endlessly repeated by Donald Trump and his parasitic bootlickers who hang on his every word. And one of those narratives is the idea that Donald Trump is just doing better for Black Americans on every metric, and that as a result, Black Americans support Trump, I don't know, more than they did in the past, more than they support other Republican presidents. Who knows exactly what the metric they're using is. And Donald Trump will often tout this. He'll say, I'm doing better with the Black Americans, or as he sometimes calls them, the blacks, than who knows who. And it's kind of a weird thing to say from the outset. The reality is that it's also not true. Some of the things Donald Trump will talk about are Black unemployment, wages for Black Americans, among other things. But we now have data. There's a new Quinnipiac poll that breaks down this information, and I want to look at some of the interesting numbers on it. Now, when asked, do you approve of how Donald Trump is handling his job, you will notice that 2% of Black Americans approve of the job Donald Trump is doing as president of the United States. That's the cell in red on the chart that I'm showing you on the screen. You might also notice that Donald Trump's approval rating is only 35% among women. That's the blue shaded cell on the image that we have on screen. And one last notable thing, normally support of Republicans goes up with age. The older groups are successively more and more likely to support the Republican. Right now, approval of Trump among 65 and over Americans is lower than among those aged 50 to 64. Notice the green shaded cell on the chart. So a number of interesting things to talk about here. Number one is that, not surprisingly, once again, Donald Trump's coalition is not really much of a coalition, with the exception of some Hispanic support that he's enjoying, about 28 or 30%, I believe. Donald Trump's constituency is basically middle-aged white men. That is the primary constituency of Donald Trump. And what's fascinating about that is that there are groups that are disproportionately made of middle-aged white men that are not doing well under Donald Trump. Think to Midwestern farmers, historically lifelong Republican Midwestern farmers who are not doing well under Donald Trump because of the tariffs. But as I've said before, just because his key demographic groups aren't doing well as a result of his policy does not mean that they are going to go out and vote for a Democrat. So that's something to keep in mind. So let's get back to the Black Americans thing. The massive victory with the Black Americans that Donald Trump has been touting. 2 years now, he's been saying he's making America greater than ever for Black people. And 2% approve of the job that Donald Trump is doing. Now, we already know what the Trumpists are going to say. If you present them with this information, they will say, David, that's not because Trump isn't doing good things for Black Americans. It's because Black people are on the plantation. They've been bamboozled by Democrats into being against Republicans no matter what the Republican does for them, which is maybe the most patronizing thing that can be said about a group of voters, that they simply don't care what happens. They don't base their support on what Donald Trump is doing. They just support Democrats over Republicans because they are, apply whatever phrase you want, bamboozled, on the plantation, whatever. And this is, of course, extraordinarily disrespectful. It ignores that Black Americans may not support Trump because of his racially tinged policies and his racially tinged comments and the 2 years of playing coy with white nationalism. Give me a break. So the important point here is Trumpists will make a lot of noise about Candace Owens and Blexit, this totally failed movement. It's almost like a fake movement to get Black people to exit the Democratic Party as if it's some kind of a rational choice to vote for Democrats. Trumpists will cheer Diamond and Silk. These are two women who are Black and love Trump. If you haven't heard of them, great. Don't even bother to look them up. They are totally toxic and terrible. Trumpists will cheer that, Ben Carson is part of Donald Trump's cabinet. And then when you look at the numbers, when the rubber meets the road, 2% of Black Americans support Donald Trump. The narrative is false. Do not fall for it. But do follow The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. I also posted to my Instagram page today, david.pakman. I posted a video from yesterday's Twitch live stream where something happened to my microphone where my voice went down an octave and people started calling me David Chadman on stream. That's my latest post at david.pakman on Instagram. Make sure you're following me there. We will take a quick break. Thom Hartmann joins me next to talk about his new book, out today. That's after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Thom Hartmann, who's host of the Thom Hartmann program and also author of the new book out today, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. Very timely release. Thom, so great to have you today.
Hey, David. It's always a pleasure to be on your program. Thank you.
So just to start with, what's your process when you do a new book? Because you've done a number of them. I would guess more than 20 at this point, although I don't have the full list in front of me. Do you get an idea and then you start to do some initial research? What's the sort of process that you go through when you work on a new book project?
I've always likened it to pregnancy. I get fertilized essentially with an idea. And in the case of this book, it was back in probably 97, 98, right around 2000. Louise and I bought a house in Vermont, and in the attic over the carriage house, there was an old water-stained, essentially ruined collection of the 1909 publication, the first time that Thomas Jefferson's complete works had ever been published. And I spent the next year and a half reading that and kept finding his just raving, ranting references to John Marshall and the Supreme Court and the Marbury decision. So that was the beginning of it. And then, it kind of gestates over the years. I wrote parts of this into Unequal Protection, a book I published in 2000. But, when we came up with this idea for a series of relatively small and short books, I really wanted to go back and do a deep dive on this topic. And so and as I started writing, it just became more and more urgent until finally I was like, oh my God, I got to get this thing out. And the book is now out, and it's pretty wide ranging. And I think there's some real shockers and ahas in this book for people.
Yeah, I mean, just in thinking of if this was first an idea years ago, the way in which the Supreme Court has changed over the period of time that you've been thinking about this book, and the way that it's now affecting day-to-day the lives of day-to-day Americans has changed pretty drastically in a sense. I mean, what if we go back to the very beginning, what was the initial purpose of the Supreme Court envisioned to be?
Well, as the Constitution lays it out, and as you can read in Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, the court basically had two purposes. One was to have primary jurisdiction, in other words, be the first court that you go to for things like disputes between the states, disputes between the United States, the federal government and individual states, disputes between the federal government and foreign countries, and certain parts of maritime law. And then secondly, it had appellate jurisdiction. In other words, it's the court that you appeal things to as basically where the buck stops, the final court of appeals. So, if two people get into a legal dispute and one wins, but the other appeals, and then they win and the other appeals, and it goes back and forth and back and forth, the buck's got to stop somewhere. And the whole point of that was the Supreme Court. And Article 3, Section 2 makes that pretty clear.
And how has that become very different from the purpose or the position that the Supreme Court has today?
Well, there's this thing called judicial review, which is the ability of a court, in this case the Supreme Court, to determine that a law is or is not in compliance with the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. And if you read Hamilton's notes, Hamilton's the Federalist Papers, the articles that they published in 1788 trying to sell the new Constitution to the American people. In several of his, there's I believe 4 of them that he wrote about the court system and the Supreme Court specifically, and in several of them he just comes right out and says, the Supreme Court will not have the power to strike down laws. Not quite in those words, but it's fairly clear. But in another place in one of them he says, well, maybe they will. And there was no consensus among the founders on this, or among the framers of the Constitution. There was a lot of debate about it, and it was never resolved. And so from 1797, when the Constitution was ratified, or 1787, 1789, when we officially became what we are now, until 1803, there was basically, the court was seen as simply the court of final appeals. And then in 1803, in the Marbury versus Madison case, John Marshall, the Chief Justice, who John Adams had put on the court the day that he left office as a slap in the face to Thomas Jefferson. Marshall was Jefferson's third cousin, and they hated each other, and he was a high Federalist. So Adams at that point hated Jefferson, and vice versa. So anyhow, John Marshall said, I'm going to strike down parts of the Judiciary Act of 1797, and Jefferson went nuts. He said, if this decision stands, then the Constitution has become a thing of wax to be molded in the hands of the judiciary. And under this construction, the Constitution has become a fellow de se, which is Latin for a suicide pact. And this decision makes the court, the Supreme Court, the most despotic of the 3 branches, whereas Hamilton in the Federalist Papers had said that the Supreme Court was the least likely to offend. They have neither the power of the purse, which is the legislature, nor the power of the sword, which is the executive branch, the presidency. And so it really flipped American jurisprudence on its head. It created such a firestorm, and Jefferson was so outraged that the court basically didn't do this again for another 40 years, 50 years. In fact, 53 years. It was in 1856, the second time that the Supreme Court, in a big way, used judicial review to when Roger Taney was the Chief Justice, when he decided that he would once and for all settle the slavery issue in a decision called Dred Scott. And that decision, of course, led us right into the Civil War. So those are the only two times that the Supreme Court in the first 60, 70 years of America, 80 years of America in history, used this power. Now the Supreme Court uses it in almost every single decision. It's and so they really have, we flipped from being basically a democratic constitutional democracy to essentially a constitutional monarchy, which is what Jefferson pointed out back in the day, where the monarchs are the unelected, lifetime appointed members of the Supreme Court.
So so to think about some of the decisions that were made by judicial review. So if we think about Brown v. Board of Education, Roe v. Wade, the 2015 gay marriage decision, to sort of like a modern left-winger who casually follows politics, you might see those decisions and say, I like the outcome, so therefore maybe this judicial review thing isn't quite so bad. The two questions I have on that are, number one, should we be evaluating this on the basis of particular decisions that we do or don't like? And then number two, are those maybe good decisions from the point of view of a modern American leftist outweighed by other bad decisions?
Right. Well, first of all, there have been far more bad decisions than good decisions from the point of view of a leftist, from destroying union rights to destroying civil rights to destroying voting rights. The Supreme Court has consistently for largely since the 1880s, the 1870s, as Reconstruction was falling apart, almost always, with the exception of a short period after Franklin Roosevelt's administration, during and after, has ruled on the side of corporations and very, very wealthy individuals. I mean, it's just very straightforward. In terms of the decisions that you mentioned, just to take Roe v. Wade, for example, because there's a chapter about that in my book, and people like to point to that. In 1961, the birth control pill was legalized. It was, the FDA approved it. By 65, the birth control pill was in widespread use across the United States, as were other methods of birth control. And in the Griswold v. Connecticut decision, the Supreme Court struck down the Connecticut state law against even married couples having any kind of birth control, including condoms, in their house. It was illegal in Connecticut up until 1965. And then birth control became very, very widespread. New devices were coming out. And so by the early 1970s, the women's movement was really, really picking up steam. Women's rights in the workplace, women's rights, the right of women to control their own reproductive functions, their bodily functions and whatnot. And so what the Roe decision did, and then the subsequent Planned Parenthood v. Casey, where they came up with the whole 3-trimester idea, which is really something that the legislature should do. What the Roe decision did is public opinion was rapidly moving in the direction of abortion being legal. And had Roe not been decided the way it was, there's a pretty broad consensus. And I've had this conversation with a number of, fairly high-profile feminists, people whose names you'd recognize. I mean, you can find them on our website. There was a fairly broad consensus that within a decade or so, abortion would be legalized, at least in most states across the United States, and the pressure would build eventually. By short-circuiting that in 73 with the Roe decision, you could make the argument, and I think I do well in the book, that really what that decision did is it created a reactionary backlash. And that reactionary backlash has led to the death of a number of abortion doctors, the general harassment of women all across the country, shutting down abortion facilities, now shutting down Planned Parenthood facilities that don't even offer abortion. As a result, we're seeing rates of cervical and uterine cancer start to increase in these states where this is happening. Had it been through the legislative process, there wouldn't have been a dispute about its legitimacy. I would say there was a similar trend with Brown in 1954. Now, you could make the case in both cases, in 54 with African Americans and in 73 with women, that had the Supreme Court not decided in that way, and if it did take another decade or so for public opinion to catch up to the point where everything got decided, that a lot of people would have gotten hurt. And I would agree with that. But I think that the consequence of the court intervening in these ways is broadly not helpful.
That's interesting. So to take the Roe v. Wade example specifically, the idea is if instead of a Supreme Court decision in 1973 legalizing abortion, you saw states do it individually from the period starting in 73 and ending in 83, just to pick a 10-year period.
Well, they already were in the starting.
Yeah, right. So it actually started earlier in a sense. But so there was a 10-year period there that you would have ended up with very similar legalization, but with less political controversy that might have avoided much of the anti-choice activism of the 40 years that followed.
That's correct, because the main claim of the forced pregnancy crowd is we got screwed by the Supreme Court. The kings and queens made a decision and we had no say in it. And that's a legitimate complaint, frankly. And I would say that's a legitimate complaint for people like you and me to say, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act that passed the Senate unanimously.
Right. Now, if you zoom out a little bit, you mentioned corporations versus individuals. If you had to summarize the gist of how the Supreme Court has decided over the last 50 years, is that the most notable way that you would categorize it, in favor of a large corporation versus in favor of the individual? Or is there some other lens that is maybe even more relevant or precise?
Well, the court has typically been on the side of property and power. And to a certain extent, that's a result of it's basically a conservative institution. I don't mean in the political sense. I mean in the, slow motion, cautious, although some of these decisions, overturning the Voting Rights Act, for example, are pretty radical. But, and you could argue Brown and Roe were as well. But, the Supreme Court is basically that, not number one. Number two, at the time that the Constitution was constructed, the hot new things in the landscape of the Enlightenment thinkers, and certainly the founders and framers were on the tail end of the Enlightenment, which arguably started 100 years earlier when John Locke wrote some 2 treatises on government, and said people should have the right to life, liberty, and private property. Private property was a relatively new thing, at least for commoners. I mean, it still wasn't a thing for women or people of color. In fact, it wasn't a thing for women until the 1970s in the United States. In 1973, I had to co-sign my wife's application for a credit card because women were not allowed to have them in their own names without their husband's or father's permission. But, in any case, for white men, property rights was a big deal in the 1600s. That the king no longer owned your underwear and your wife and your house and everything else. And by the 1700s, by the 1770s, property rights were pretty much accepted. But it was the new thing, that and human rights, civil rights, which is what the Bill of Rights was. But there was no consideration of the rights of the environment, because the environment seemed to be vast and limitless. And, who cares how much junk goes into the rivers? It doesn't matter. And that's one of the problems that we have to address right now, and it is being addressed in part by this Giuliani case before the Supreme Court, which is also mentioned in the book. And if I could just close the loop on our earlier conversation about judicial review, after Jefferson went nuts about the Marbury decision, one of his friends, and I'd have to look in my own book and see who wrote the letter to him. I think it might have been it might have been Mr. Mason. But in any case, one of his friends wrote him a letter saying, if you don't think that the Supreme Court should be the arbiter of what is constitutional and what is not constitutional, who should be? And Jefferson wrote back and said, the people themselves. And then he explained, and by the way, that phrase is the title of a book by Larry Kramer, the former dean of the Stanford Law School, that is a brilliant critique of judicial review. The point. And people will say to me, well, what if Congress passed a law saying that if you speak ill of the president, he can put you in prison? Isn't that a clear violation of First Amendment rights of free speech? And shouldn't the Supreme Court intervene immediately? And my answer is the same as Jefferson's answer was in 1804, is that in 1798, John Adams passed just that law, the Alien and Sedition Act. And the day that he signed that law, he put Ben Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bach, who published a newspaper in Massachusetts called the Aurora, put him in prison. And in prison for writing an op-ed in which Benjamin Franklin Bach said that John Adams was, quote, or there's a paraphrase, but it's close to an exact quote, old, toothless, querulous, and balding. A fellow by the name of Luther Baldwin was sitting in a bar in Newark, New Jersey, when John Adams and his wife Abigail came through town in their carriage, and they had mandated that whenever they came through a town, the military had to come out and do a 21-gun salute. And Baldwin said to the bartender, "There goes President Adams. They're shooting the cannons. I hope they shoot him in the arse." And he didn't know that the bar owner was a Federalist who turned him into John Adams. John Adams had him thrown in prison. I mean, 20 newspapers were shut down. Matthew Lyon on the floor of the House of Representatives got in a fight with Roger Griswold, the Connecticut representative, over this issue. And John Adams had him shipped off to an unheated jail cell in Vergennes, Vermont for 2 years. He ran for re-election in the election of 1800 and won his seat back. The Supreme Court never intervened. What killed the Alien Sedition Act, this insanely unconstitutional law, the thing that created the schism between Jefferson and Adams that was so great. I mean, Jefferson left town the day it was signed and literally never talked to Adams in person again. The thing that fixed that was the election of 1800. It was the people themselves. So ultimately, either, and this is what Jefferson was arguing, either we believe in democracy or we don't. If we want to try and create a constitutional monarchy, then yeah, make the monarchs the Supreme Court justices. It's better than a hereditary family, and give them final say over everything. But if you want to have an actual constitutional democracy, then the people have to be the ones who make the decisions.
The book is out today. It's called The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. I was lucky enough to get an early copy. We've been speaking with the book's author, Thom Hartmann. Thom, so great to have you on today.
Thank you, David. Great talking.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So U.S. income inequality has hit the highest level in 50 years, we have just learned. And this is measured using something called the Gini Index, G-I-N-I. Let's talk about how the metric works. This is a measure of distribution of income or wealth. You can have an income distribution measured with Gini or wealth distribution, and it's across income percentiles. So it goes from 0 to 1. 0 would be there is perfect equality. If everyone has the same income, the Gini coefficient is 0. If everyone has the same wealth, the Gini coefficient is 0. 1 would be perfect inequality, meaning if you have a country and one person has all the income or all the wealth, the Gini coefficients for income and wealth, respectively, would be 1. And you can track it over time. So in the United States in 2017, it was 0.482, and it went up in 2018 to 0.485. It's an increase of about 0.5%. This is a very big calculation, so it moves really, really slowly. And then you can break it down in more detail if you want. You could let's look at a change in the inequality by gender, or look at it by the states people live in, blue states versus red states, or you could look at it by race or by age or whatever you want. Wealth inequality went up in quite a few heartland states, which is interesting because Donald Trump's trade policy is potentially to blame there, actually impacting inequality, both income and wealth in some of those heartland states. States on the East Coast and the West Coast still have higher inequality overall. And that's really not surprising since you have more wealthy people on the coasts. And the most equal states, interestingly enough, are Utah, Alaska, and the Dakotas, and maybe Iowa as well is on that list. And the right loves to look at that and say, look, you've got all these liberals who talk about equality and they say they want equality, but it's the red states that actually have the most equality. And of course, this is one of those very low energy interpretations. It's not a very high thinking interpretation, because the reason that a lot of red states have low inequality is that you just have way more people that are not doing well. And the truth is that the degree of inequality matters. There's lots of externalities as well, crime and others. but the reason for inequality is also really important. So if you want to get an understanding of this, if you want to understand inequality, number one, there's a lot of good books that I could recommend that you should read. But when you're looking at something like the Gini coefficient, you need to often look qualitatively. And if I'm to pick my battles, I have way less of a problem with an entrepreneur who becomes wealthy by creating something compared to someone who inherits a ton of money and then uses the money to buy influence and to influence legislation to allow them to get even wealthier. Now, I want to be clear. We can argue all inequality is a problem, whether it's inherited or whether it's the new rich of entrepreneurship and the tech world. But when you break it down, there are different categories. And it's important that on the left, if we want to fight against inequality, we should understand the sources of it and make sure that we're dealing with the most serious problems first. Now, that being said, we have a system that encourages even the entrepreneurs who become wealthy through the business they've created to then get into the influence peddling and to become one of the people that is indistinguishable from those who have just inherited money and use that money to peddle influence and to change legislation for their benefit. And then, of course, you also have entrepreneurs who are getting wealthy thanks to the tax sheltering laws and the other stuff that the legacy influence peddlers were able to get passed. So it's not a clean cut the way I might be suggesting, but the point is we should be able to look at this issue more qualitatively and really determine what is most important to be addressing right away. But the reality is that if this continues to go in the same direction of growing inequality, it's going to cause more social unrest. It's going to cause more crime. It's ultimately going to precipitate an increasingly unsustainable system. Now, the solution to the problem is different depending on your political ideology. You might have someone who is an actual socialist. I'm not talking about someone who wants, government healthcare, but you might have an actual socialist who says the only solution is to totally socialize the means of production, socialize property, and that's the way that we're going to fix this problem. Social Democrats would have a different point of view, which is some degree of inequality is okay. But what we want to do is put some limits at the top and use those to raise the floor so that we are constricting inequality to a more narrow band such that people aren't getting left behind, such that the riches that come to some, the few, from the system that we have are by statute, by law, being reinvested to better circumstances for everybody. That would be a socially democratic approach. And that's really at the heart of a lot of the debate that is happening within the left right now. Certainly the right has a completely different point of view with so-called free markets and all of the other things that they say are really great, which have completely failed us over the last 150 years in this country. But the data, once again, income inequality increasing in the United States from 2017 to 2018. I will be giving this Saturday the keynote address at the Grassroots Radio Conference in Rochester, New York. I hope you'll join me there. I've been going to this conference off and on for many years. I remember going once years ago in Humboldt County, California, up there about 4 hours, roughly 4 hours north, as I recall, from San Francisco. A real cannabis country. Very interesting to see that. Another time I went to the Grassroots Radio Conference in Kansas City, Missouri. Got some great barbecue, met some great people. And this year, the conference is in Rochester, New York. I will be speaking at 4 p.m. local time, that's Eastern time, on Saturday. It is a media conference. So the panels and the sessions are mostly based around media and independent media. It's really great stuff. And it would be great for you to attend the entire conference. But I've also asked the GRC to make tickets available just to the keynote if people want to come and see that. It's only $10. I'm guessing there's another $1 or so service charge or something like that. 4 p.m. this Saturday, October, what is the date? Is it the 4th, right? No, the 5th. Saturday is the 5th, I believe. Man, I'm getting, today's the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th. Yeah, whatever the date is on Saturday, that's the date. And all the info is at grassrootsradioconference.org. I would love to see you there. I will speak about media. I will speak about fake news, attacks on media, and all of that stuff. And then there will be an opportunity to ask questions as well. Great times to be had by all. I've never been to Rochester, so I'm looking forward to it. And once again, the website where you can find all of the information is grassrootsradioconference.org. We have a voicemail number that you can call any time of day. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a really good practical question about getting engaged in politics. Take a listen to this.
Hi, David. My name is Carlos. I've been trying to call in on the show for a while and haven't been successful, so I thought I'd leave you a message. And here's the question. I know the big topic right now is impeachment, some other more pressing issues, but one of the things that I wanted to see you cover, I wanted to hear your opinion on, is how you think that people who are somewhat less than wealthy can enter politics successfully.
Right.
I've been interested in politics for many years, and I'm getting to a point in my career where I'm kind of considering retiring and going into politics, but I'm not exactly Andrew Yang or Tom Steyer or somebody else who already has a whole bunch of.
Right. Okay. Somehow they got cut off. I guess he was going to say a whole bunch of money. So here's the thing. This is a great question to be asking. What we need more people that don't come from the same 3 or 4 industries in politics. But you're right. If you are not in a financial position that is particularly strong, it's going to be very difficult to become, for example, a senator. There are places, as we know, people like AOC who without a lot of money have become elected members of the House of Representatives, but that is also difficult. The best thing to do is to get involved at the local level. And this accomplishes a lot of things. Number one, to get on school boards, even sometimes to run for city council. I've seen people with no money get on city councils in different places. It doesn't take a lot of money to do it, and it's a great place to start. But it also does something else that the left has been failing at. I've been talking for years to anyone who will listen about how the left has been failing at getting the bullpen built up, getting the farm league built up. And one of the best ways to do that is by starting to get into the city councils and the school boards and all of the other things. You can influence policy, yes, on a local level, but in ways that do matter to the people in that community. Doesn't require the outsized resources that are often required to run for higher office. And it can be used, if your aspiration is eventually higher office, it can be used as a precursor to start building a following, building a coalition. So that's what I would encourage you to do. I have no idea where you live and what's available in terms of government, but there are lots of options. You can get on the board of local non-commercial radio or television stations. That's something I did back in Northampton, Massachusetts. I was on the board of NCTV, Northampton Community Television, now relaunched as Northampton Open Media. There are limitless options that require very little money. Some require no money whatsoever because these positions are just open sometimes, and you can use them to get to other positions if that's what you want. So that would be my advice. We will talk on the bonus show today about Stormy Daniels' settlement over the disastrous arrest at that Ohio strip club. This is an old story that we're following up on. We will talk about cancer cases connected to tap water contaminants, and we will talk about a town in Ohio that has made Election Day a paid holiday by swapping it for Columbus Day, which is, of course, upcoming. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.